Professor Romila Thapar, thank you very much for agreeing to this interview. The broad theme of which is a question that has been animating a lot of people in India, of course, but also well-wishers of India around the world, which is critical thinking in India somehow under threat? In posing this question, I have in mind not just overt or covert pressures from the state or political figures or political authority, but also, in a sense, public attitudes. The growing, at least to my mind, tendency for the public to acquiesce in the state's own intolerant attitude towards dissent, towards difference. The middle classes, the ease with which the middle class buys into hero worship, cult of personality, excessive valorization of the nation. These are all very much part of present day India. And if you look at the election of Donald Trump, if you look at political trends in Europe, then clearly this may also be, in some sense, a global phenomenon. Even though the closing of the Indian mind, if I were to call it that, has been going on for some time, and I would say longer than the tenure of this present government. You could trace it back at least a decade or longer. There is a sense in which these negative trends have accentuated or sharpened over the past 2.5 years. If in 2015 we saw in this country the debate over tolerance and intolerance, which was really a critique on the part of artists, writers, cultural personalities of the government's own tolerance or toleration of violence and chauvinism and its failure to act when minorities were being targeted. And we saw the way in which the government was very prickly when intellectuals wrote against the government or returned their awards and so on. And then in 2016, the attack seems to have shifted to the university. We saw the events in the way they unfolded in Jawaharlal Nehru University. I would say things have moved on. We have a very toxic media environment where excessive jingoism seems to have become the norm. And broadly speaking, you have a situation where the executive branch of government is encroaching on or making inroads in virtually every countervailing institution that this country has, the judiciary, parliament. We've now seen even the central bank, not to speak of the media, etc. In this kind of an environment, where, to my mind, critical thinking in India is under threat, how do you see the role of public intellectuals? What should they be doing? What is their role, if any, in dealing with this kind of situation?
Well, you raised a host of issues. Before I get on to the public intellectual, let me just say that I think, I've been disturbed, like all of us have been disturbed, by not just what has been happening in our country, but the worldwide thing, and the election of Trump was certainly a startling wake-up call, as it were. And I think it does raise a couple of questions which need to be answered, which is that why are we losing the sense of critical inquiry that we always appreciated and held? I mean, it is true that the idea of a critical inquiry is usually associated with the middle class, people coming from the middle class, and there is an element there of very conventional thinking, largely, but there is also an element of dissent. And I think that one should really look at what is happening there as well. And admittedly, it's true that the dissent has not been as vocal as one would have thought, which does add to this notion that there is a decline, and there is in fact a decline of critical inquiry. But I think the two issues that it does bring up very strongly, to my way of thinking, one is the whole question of the institutions and structures of democracy. Have we come to a point today where we have to rethink what those institutions and structures should be? We've always based ourselves on things like elections, representation, how to represent opinion and people and so on, the articulation of people's ideas, the whole question of majoritarianism and so on. Is this sufficient? Or do we have to go beyond this now and consider the fact that there seem to be all these people coming into power on really a minority vote. I mean, 1/3 is hardly a majority vote,
Right.
and yet the process is such that they have come to power. Even Trump's vote is not such an overwhelming vote.
No, in fact, he lost the popular vote.
He lost
exactly.
popular vote. So I think that there is a need now for people to sit down and say, right, democracy means these basic institutions, but how do we make them effective? How do we make them more representative? How do we allow people to participate much more? And determine, in a sense, other than just giving a vote, the one man, one vote thing, I think has been now overplayed. And I'm not suggesting that we take away the vote, but how do we strengthen that vote? How do we do something to make that vote much more effective and encourage people to come out and vote? Because there's a lot of sort of sitting back and saying, I don't like the system, I'm not interested, I won't vote. That's one set of questions we have to address. And the other, I think, came to me very strongly that, you know, America was always presented as not just the democratic system, but also a highly educated society. And by all accounts, it is a highly educated society. What went wrong with the education? What is it about the content of education that we need to now consider much more seriously than we've done before? And this applies to India equally much, in fact, much more even, because education in this country, how many people ask the question of what are you actually teaching the child? You're giving the child information, you're expecting the child to repeat that information, and all this business about objective questions and this, that and the other is really the old catechismic style of you're given a determined question, a predetermined question, you're given a predetermined answer, and that's what you produce. Now, for me, the essential qualifier in any kind of educational system is teaching a child to think critically, to ask questions. We're not doing that. In fact, we have ministers who stand up and say, you can't ask questions. Yes.
Now, it's anti-national to ask questions.
It's anti-national to ask
or
questions.
Or if you ask questions about black money, this is because you have black money.
Because you have black
exactly.
money, you see. Now, I mean, this is an absurdity which I think needs to be torn apart, because the whole purpose of education is to train people to ask questions. And unless you do that, unless you produce a citizenship that is questioning, it's going to be very, very difficult to have intelligent debates on the representation of people in a democracy. I think that is very important. And there again, I mean, you know, it's all very well to say that America has very good schools and all the rest of it, but what are they teaching? Are they in fact teaching this? Or does this critical inquiry element come in at the university level? And even then, for the majority of Americans, it doesn't exist. So I do feel very strongly about that there are these institutions that we take for granted in a democratic system, which maybe we need to look at now more critically and question the effect that they're having on the whole issue of the kind of governance that's coming our way.
Mm.
Now, this is something, yes, that educationists and other people need to think about very carefully, and certainly the public intellectual plays an important role in this. And when I say the public intellectual plays an important role, how do I define the public intellectual? The public intellectual is a person who is in a profession, first of all. It's a professional person. It's a person who is respected in his or her profession. It's not just anybody, it's not just any journalist, but it's a journalist who has a reputation as being good, or, you know, a social scientist, or a scientist for that matter. It's somebody who is respected. The person is respected for the fact that the knowledge that he tries to convey to the public is reliable knowledge. You know, it's not fantasy. He's not just getting up and spouting, but he knows what he's talking about. Thirdly, I think it's terribly important that a person like that must have a sense of ethics. And that is something that we're rapidly losing, both in the practice of politics, in the practice of governance, in the practice of education, and so on. the bringing back of not saying this is good and this is bad and you have to be moral about this or moral about that, but the sense of asking the question each time, is this ethical or not? Which is a question that we have ceased to ask now. So I think that is terribly important in the making of a public intellectual. The relationship of the public intellectual to society is that the public intellectual must have a concern for civil society, must have a concern for the rights, the duties, the rights, the obligations of citizens to a state. And wherever this is not being brought to the fore, help to bring it to the fore. And finally, and very importantly, the public intellectual is there to protect the rights and the obligations of the citizen. And that protection, I think, is really fundamental, especially in situations where people get by with all kinds of gimmickries. People get by with all kinds of dishonesties. And it's terribly important that there be a scatter of public intellectuals, visible, audible, saying, sorry, this is not the way to do it, and to protect those rights.
Right. If you're right in tracing some of the recent developments that people find, unfathomable in some ways, to problems in the way the university system has functioned, that would, in a way, suggest a reason why, for the current dispensation in India, zeroing in on universities is so important, and why universities have in some sense emerged as the front line for official interference, official action, as well as resistance. And what's been remarkable over the last, say, 2.5 years, beginning with the film students at the FTII in Pune, and then you had the agitation of students in the University of Hyderabad over Rohit Vemila's suicide, and then in JNU, other campuses, is that students and faculty members don't seem to be taking this assault on their autonomy and their right to think critically lying down. Do you think that holds out some promise for the way the situation may evolve?
Well, I think up to a point it's logical. We have had an element of two things. We have had an element of suggesting that education means critical thinking. And certainly in universities like the JNU, for example, from day one, we have said to students, you've got to ask questions. Stop us and ask questions. Think about what you're reading and writing. Inquire into what you're reading and writing. So that has been an element in some institutions. What is interesting is that the institutions that are picked on are institutions that have had a trace of critical inquiry. Right. I mean, they're not picking on any university and any institution. They pick on those where people have learned to think slightly independently. And in addition to that, of course, you've got the other feature, which is terribly important, and that is that in any kind of democratic system, and I think up to a point we have been developing this in the past, that there are certain institutions that can claim autonomy. And universities are amongst those, universities and research institutions of a higher level. And they must not only claim it, they must protect that autonomy. And I think part of this problem has been precisely that people have seen that the autonomy of the university or the autonomy of the institution is being infringed in a very serious way. And it's important to maintain this autonomy because you cannot have a democratic system in which the government controls absolutely everything. You have to have some institutions that are beyond government control, that are autonomous. Now, many of us have been arguing, I mean, take the case of something like textbooks. Many of us have been arguing for the last decade or more that the agencies that produce textbooks should be handled only by professionals, B, that they should be autonomous of government. So agencies like the NCERT should be autonomous bodies. manned by social scientists and so on, who supervise the writing of textbooks. And it doesn't mean that every time the government changes, the textbooks change.
Which is what tends to happen now.
This is what happens now. We've reduced it to an absolute joke. No one takes them seriously. I mean, I get telephone calls from parents saying, what do I tell my child who's sitting for the CBSE exam? Did Akbar marry Jodhabai or did he not? And I mean, history has been reduced to those kinds of questions. Now, so I think it is extremely important that the autonomy of institutions be underlined and protected. And this is one area in which public intellectuals do play an important role.
Right.
In addition to the professionals. Now, professionals as a group in this country tend to be, partly because these institutions are government funded, they tend to argue that if the funds are coming from government, we have to listen to what government says. But when you have changeability in government policy, surely it is the right of the professional to say, this is the policy that we require. And, if there is to be a change, it has to come from professionals and not from a bureaucrat or a politician who has a whim or a fancy that it should be done in a particular way.
And in a way here you're battling actually an older legacy issue, which is the over-bureaucratization in some ways of education, where even to change or update a syllabus requires several committee meetings and perhaps going various levels higher, than the immediate faculty who are going to teach that.
Yeah. And the fact that this can be done much more simply is something that we demonstrated when we started the JNU. It was a university that did not follow any other syllabus of any other university. We talked about it, we discussed it, we debated it, we worked it out very carefully, and we made a bid for that. And it worked. I mean, and that is one of the things that one is, in those of us who are in academia, one of the things we're really frightened of is that autonomy to think and that autonomy to work out a syllabus in a curriculum and teach it. That may go.
For some time you've been zeroing in on the importance of asking questions, that this is the fundamental problem of our time. And academia is one area where this has to take place, but obviously the media is the other important sector of society where a questioning attitude has to be adopted. And it's quite alarming to me as a journalist to see how the practice of journalism has shifted from a profession where, in a way, one took pride in being adversarial against those in authority, to a situation where big media today prides itself in being the conscience keeper of the state, conscience keeper of the nation, egging the state on to battle in a more determined fashion against enemies, be they external or internal. How troubled are you by the way in which media culture in this country has evolved? I don't know how much of a television news watcher you are, but there's a lot that's pretty horrid that's out there night after night.
Oh, I think one of the reasons why I've ceased being a television news watcher, or a television watcher as it were, is precisely because I find it absolutely indigestible. I mean, you sit there and look at what is being presented and you say, how can they do this? It's a deliberate sort of, in many cases, in many channels, it's a deliberate misleading. In other channels, it's a refusal to ask questions. Again, you're back to that. I mean, you have a crisis. You have a crisis which involves, for example, the Adivasi community, whether it is the worship of their sacred mountain, or whether it is the demand for a better life that is going on in central India and Bastar and so on. How many news channels have actually gone to Adivasi villages and asked the Adivasi people why they are supporting or opposing the Nakshals? Hardly ever. You get people from Delhi who are commenting on this all the time, but go ask the people who are actually involved in it. You don't do that. I mean, with the exception of one or two channels, by and large, there's a tendency to have pontification from certain predictable people on every issue. And that is really not what is the media's role, at least as I see it. I mean, there again, people might say that the role of the media is simply to entertain. which I don't accept, because I think that if the media is in fact the medium of communication, then it has to do much more than that. Then it has to do things like having serious discussions. And I don't buy this every time I talk to media people, television people, and say, why don't you raise the level of your discussions, and why don't you, at least half an hour every evening, have a really serious discussion by people who are professionally equipped to talk about the subject. And they say we lose our viewership. Now, I don't buy that at all.
So this old alibi that we are giving readers or viewers what they want is not something you accept?
I don't think so. I think that you can change readership's demands by giving them something better. I mean, French television, for example, is a lovely case of where they started years ago, they started a program, I think it was half an hour or 40 minutes, of book reviewing. They'd take one book and they'd get 3 people to discuss that book. And it became one of the most popular programs in France. Now, France is not a extra highly educated country. It's normal like any European country. And I think the point, of course, is that you have a variety of people who are looking in. You give them that variety of programs, but somewhere you make sure that the quality of the variety you're giving them is a little higher than just the lowest common denominator. And that is where I think that the media doesn't really reach out. Right. It doesn't, when there is a problem, it doesn't reach out to the people who are concerned with that problem and ask questions about, why they're concerned, what their concern is, what the problem is. You can't generalize sitting at a distance. You have to go out. And that going out is not enough.
Right. This shift in official discourse, if you were confronted with an uncomfortable point of view in the past, the obvious tactic would be to ignore it, or to starve a department of funds, or to ensure that future hiring took place in a different kind of way. Today, the government or the people in authority seem to have successfully mobilized a section of the media to actually assist them in the attack on university autonomy, the attack on critical thinking, the attack on just differences of opinion. I mean, a bunch of kids shouting slogans, or a professor videotaped giving a lecture and clips of that being shown, and public sentiment being incited that, oh, look at what our universities are up to. This is really something new and very, very dangerous.
Well, I think it's the use of media now not to communicate, and not to communicate the reality, but to propagate ideology. This is a different use of the media altogether. I mean, I was very struck by the fact that last year, when we had this outburst on intolerance and so on, various TV channels asked me to do interviews. And I did some. And those were shown, even though I said things in a fairly direct fashion. Right. 2 channels, important channels, invited me. We fixed the day and the time, and then I was rung up and told, we're very sorry. We're not given permission.
Right.
And I thought to myself that if, for a simple interview of 10 minutes, you have to take permission from Jo Upar Baitha Hai, then really, where is the autonomy of the media?
Right, exactly. No, this is something that's, media has always had problems in this country, and I've been a journalist now for 20 years and have worked in media organizations in a situation where we've had 4 or 5, maybe 6 prime ministers, Narasimha Rao, Deve Gowda, Vajpayee, Gujral, Manmohan and Narendra Modi. But the climate today is really quite different in the sense that media proprietors are far more risk averse, far less willing to ask questions, far less willing to have their people ask questions, and far more willing to clamp down on whether it's an interview or a debate topic or an op-ed. There's a sense in which certain kinds of questions will not be tolerated, and I think this is really what's alarming. People, you still have media freedom and academic freedom for all intents and purposes, but if important areas or questions of inquiry are shut out and not aired, that creates a problem.
You see, there are 2 reasons for that. I mean, that is happening. It does create a problem. One is you shut it out because you don't want anyone to have a dissenting opinion, and you want everybody to agree to what is going on. But you do that because you have a sense of insecurity. You yourself are not confident and secure enough to say, it doesn't matter, we have a discussion, some people will take an opposite point of view and some people won't. But when you're frightened of that, when you're frightened of opposition and dissent, then you resort to this idea of shutting people up or not allowing people to speak on the media.
Right. No, one of the aspects of present-day politics in India is that you have a ruling party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, and its parent organization, the Sangh Parivar, and of course a host of affiliated bodies which give the RSS and the BJP plausible deniability, because when they act and do things that are quite terrible, the government or the ruling party can say, well, we have nothing to do with them. But they all essentially sing to the same broad tune, and that tune in ideological terms has been, Hindu nationalism, Hindu chauvinism, whatever phrase you want to use, the Hindutva ideology. And we've seen elements of that ideology coming into play over the last 2.5 years. But I get the sense that somewhere down the line, not just the Prime Minister or the BJP or the RSS, but the whole wider Sangh Parivar has latched on to the idea of the nation and the nation under threat as being a far more potent vehicle for their kind of politics. We've seen, of course, in the campaign against JNU, which is where, in a way, this whole thing started, where they accused students of being anti-national on the basis of shouting slogans. They accused them of being seditious. Then you had this whole controversy about how politicians and people must say Bharat Mata ki Jai, and if you don't, then somehow you are being anti-national. And then, of course, the entire discourse over terrorism, the so-called surgical strikes, even the campaign against black money, is all being cast in the language of nation khatre mein hai, the nation is in danger, and if you don't stand with the government at this time, then somehow you are being unpatriotic. And most recently, we've seen even the Supreme Court of India pass a judgment making it mandatory for the national anthem to be played in movie halls, and they've prescribed in minute detail that the doors must be closed and the flag must show on the screen. As a historian, of course as a public intellectual, but as a historian you have a long view of these things. Where is this coming from? Why is nationalism, Bharat Mata, why has this acquired so much of salience today? And is there some easy way in which critics of the government can deal with this kind of pressure? Because once you go down that whole nation under threat or jingoism, it's a slippery slope, and you have TV channels now. I don't recall earlier referring to every dead soldier as a martyr, but every channel now says soldiers were martyred. So the whole language of public discourse has become very overtly nationalist, which leaves me a little bit worried as a journalist. I'm sure worries you as a historian. But how do you explain this newfound salience that the nation has in
Well, I think
public
it
life?
hasn't become overtly nationalist. It's become overtly nationalist of a particular type. One of the problems is that let me now be a historian and also be a little academic on this. Nationalism is a stage in history. It's not something that goes back to the Vedic period or the Gupta period or the Mughal period or anything of that kind. It is a change that societies undergo when they start turning towards things like industrialization and capitalism and so on, and the middle class emerges as the most important body. I mean, this is just simple history, but there it is. And nationalism emerges as a way of restructuring the different communities into a new identity and value system. And what is the identity? The identity is the citizen. You move from being a subject of a kingdom to being the citizen of a nation. And the nation is one category among a whole series of states. I mean, you've had clan societies, you've had kingdoms, you've had monarchies, empires, and so on. Now you have a nation state, that the state is a nation. what has happened in this process is a kind of misinformation, or not even information, but a form of disguising nationalism to mean the community that you wish to give priority to. And this happened in the Indian case, where you had an all-India nationalism that talked about the coming Indian citizen in colonial times, and you had a series of other nationalisms, preeminently Islamic, Muslim nationalism and Hindu nationalism, that talked about the coming of a state of a religious kind. You had Pakistan on the one hand, and you had the Hindu Rashtra in the 1930s being defined. And the difference is that a general nationalism of a nation brings all the communities together, gives them a new identity as a citizen, and the new identity is the equality of everybody, equal rights to social justice and the law, equal rights to resources, distribution, and so on. Human rights are guaranteed in the course of being a citizen. But what happens in the case of varieties of nationalism is, whether it's religious or caste or linguistic, that particular group is to be given priority. And so in the Hindu Rashtra, you have, as has been amply written about extensively, you have the Hindu citizen being a notch higher because he has the territory of British India as his Pitri Bhumi and as his Punya Bhumi.
To use Savarkar's famous phrase.
Thesis, yes, and that is really what the whole BJP, Sangh Parivar, RSS thesis is based on. Now, there is therefore a contradiction here, a tension between what many of us understand as nationalism, as such, and what they understand by nationalism, which is Hindu nationalism. It's not the same thing at all. And in a democratic setup where you're talking about the representation of everybody, every citizen, you cannot say some citizens are a notch above, and you cannot give more priority to some citizens. Everybody has to be absolutely equal. Right. Now, what do you do then in order to get around this question of defining nationalism as the ideology of the citizen, which means equal rights, equal laws, observing of laws and all the rest of it, and slightly edging in either a religious or linguistic or caste group? You do it through slogans. So when you look at the slogans that they're giving you, the slogans are all slogans that really deal with the superiority of the Hindu. They're not slogans that deal with the citizen as such. You know, the a-religious citizen.
They in fact negate that concept.
They negate that concept. And this creates a further problem. This kind of nationalism is suggestive of another problem in democracy, which is that, in a sense, democracy is dependent on being secular. You cannot have a democracy where you have predetermined majorities of whatever kind.
Right.
In a democracy, an issue comes up, and the majority comes from every part of society and takes a decision, and the next issue that comes up has a totally different constituent of majority. It doesn't have the same thing.
Right.
Therefore, how do you kind of ensure, without saying that you are a Hindu state, how do you ensure that in fact these little indicators are going to give an identity to the citizen?
Right.
You do it entirely by doing this. And in a sense, I think that this whole vigilante activity, as it is called, which is an activity that is meant to create terror in the country.
And by people who are formally outside the state but who are fully implicated.
Exactly. Yeah. And they're doing precisely this. They're bringing in this element into the definition of what is the nation.
Right. But of course they build on, when the BJP or the RSS talks of, they embrace in a formal sense the idea of, they say we need genuine secularism. They criticize others as being pseudo-secular. And what they do is that they question the democratic state's need to, in a way, act in defense of sections, which may be linguistic or religious minorities who are disadvantaged in some way, they would decry that as appeasement, as pseudo-secularism, and they latch on to those sorts of protections, which are very Gandhian or Rawlsian in any philosophical sense, but they would hold that as somehow subverting the concept of equal citizenship.
But in fact, it's not, because
Right.
the thing is that your own concept of the nation is not supporting equal citizenship fully, and your programs are not supporting equal citizenship. At least if your programs were supporting equal citizenship, one would say, yes, it's all right, but you can't allow a situation where some people are more vulnerable than others and yet talk about equal citizenship.
Right.
And this also ties in a little bit with our definition of secularism, where we keep on talking about the coexistence of religion. And I've been trying to argue that it's more than that, in the sense that it's not just the coexistence, it's the equal rights of every religion to human rights, to the constitutional laws, etc., etc. And secondly, it is that there are certain areas of social functioning where you don't allow religious organizations to call the shots.
Right.
That they have to be secular, they have to be, through secular institutions, and should not be governed by any religious organization. I mean, in a sense, education also is one of those issues which is going to come up, as if we go on becoming more and more genuinely secular, this issue will come up in a big way.
If the rise of the concept of citizen and citizenship is central, along with the whole discourse on the need for equal rights, equal claims and resources, is central to the idea of the nation, the way it historically evolved, it's ironic that in today's hyper-nationalist times, you have valorization of the nation happening side by side with attempts to convert the citizen back into being a subject in some sense.
Yeah.
You will stand up.
Yeah.
You will surrender your money.
Right.
If you don't do this, if you don't do what we say, then somehow you are against the nation. So, in the language of nation and nationalism, the citizen is stripped of her citizenship.
You see, again, that seems to me to be, there's an element of insecurity there, where you have to tell the citizen that you will do such and such to prove that you're a good national.
They take out ads in papers saying these are your fundamental duties. They don't do it for rights.
No, that's it.
Yeah.
That they don't talk about rights, and they don't concede that the citizen has the right to say, I'm sorry, but I would like the issue of Kashmir, of Bastar, of the Adivasis, or whatever it may be, the Dalits here, the burning of churches there, whatever it is, the issue. I would like it discussed publicly. The media should be taking up these discussions and saying their different points of view and so on. There's nothing anti-national about having discussions on these issues.
Right.
But again, if it's a sense of insecurity, then you start saying, you have to do this, and you have to do this, and you have to do that.
Some liberals, some intellectuals respond to the excessive nationalism of our times by, in a way, rejecting the idea of the nation. Do you think in this country, how should the public intellectual negotiate her way around this whole question? Is the language and discourse of the nation still relevant and an essential part of public discussion, or is it a category that perhaps no longer enjoys the kind of salience that it once did?
Well, I think that the fact that there is a debate going on what is meant by the nation and a national and nationalism means that the nation hasn't really got firmly embedded. This discussion will go on. But because it is a historical phase, as I see it, I also see that there are some parts of the world where they have moved beyond the nation. The European Union was one. I mean, when you consider the relationship between France and Germany and how deeply nationalism, even there and here, is tied into territory. I mean, and I think this is partly the result of cartography and the ability to draw maps and boundary lines and so on, and the boundary line becomes absolutely the firm divider. All of this, I think, is something which is part of a historical phase. And if it can be changed as it was changed in Europe, though goodness knows they may be coming back to the idea of the nation again. But at least for a period of time, they weren't. One can think of a possibility of a future, 50 years down the line, when national boundaries may not be so important. I mean, who knows? Historians don't make predictions, but there is an openness about the future. It's not that historically, let me say that the idea of the nation is not something that will go from now to eternity.
Right.
It will undergo some changes, but what those changes will be, one doesn't know.
One of the things which alarms me personally, and I'm sure a lot of other people who watch what has happened in India or Europe or the US, is a growing tendency among large sections of, I would say, the middle class, for want of a better term, to buy into the cult of leadership, to be seduced by sloganeering of one kind, vacuous slogans of one kind or the other, wild and completely crazy proposals that politicians make as a means of addressing, perhaps not even real problems. Which is why I feel that the pressure on critical thinking and the pressure on the public intellectual comes not just from the state and those who echo its concerns directly, but also from the shifting terrain among the public. What explains this? Is this product of political culture, education? What explains the public willingness to go along with a certain kind of retrogressive narrative?
Well, it's sometimes explained by the uncertainty and the insecurity of the times we're living in. Now, I don't know whether this is particular to our times or whether it was the case earlier. If I look back in my own lifetime, certainly one had the feeling, I was a child in the 30s and in school in the 40s, one had the feeling that life was secure, it was determined. And yet at the same time the national movement was going on, so as one grew a little older and became aware of the world around one realized that there was an extreme tension going on, which somehow one didn't feel so much. Now, I think one of the things that's happened is that we have really, especially in the late 20th century, gone through tremendous revolutions of change, apart from actual revolutions, both the Russian and the Chinese, and the aftermath of those, which have demonstrated that what was desired didn't actually happen, creating uncertainty there, and others like the technological revolution. Now, I mean, some of us who are reasonably intelligent and able to handle technology and so on are still very uncertain about how we're going to handle this, because it's going so fast. And, I'm constantly ringing up my grandnephew and saying, can you tell me how I do this, right, kind of thing, because it's beyond me. Now, that's very exciting if you can handle that technology, but on the other hand, if you're uncertain about it, it creates a certain insecurity. Will I be able to manage or not? Everybody says now you have to switch to net banking, and I'm sitting there saying, how does one do net banking, and will someone please teach me, and so on. There's that. Then you have been living as an isolated nation. You're very proud of your independence and your autonomy and so on, of which your economic growth in the 60s and the 70s was a very major part, as indeed was the crisis of the 90s when you switched. You switched into a market economy where you're mixing and battling and being friends with all kinds of people. And you're really a little uncertain because your own economic future is not any longer independent. It's tied into the future of others, which adds to a further kind of uncertainty, you see. And I think in all of this, it's very comforting to feel that there's somebody up there who's looking after you, who you feel, well, if I express my loyalty and faith in this person,
that person look after
me. Slightly like the tendency towards religion. You put your faith in
Right.
something else, and you do it in all honesty, and you do it with absolute, clarity that is where you want to put your faith. Maybe an element of that, when the uncertainty goes or lessens or becomes different, people will begin to become much more autonomous themselves.
And of course, Ambedkar, even back in the 40s, had warned against the tendency to have the cult of hero worship. He, of course, meant Gandhi and Jinnah.
Yeah.
But that's something that could equally apply to modern day India.
Yeah. Well, that is certainly something that nationalism does bring, the cult of hero worship. Everywhere in the world where you've had strong national movements, you've had that hero worship, because in a sense it's the hero that sort of leads you on and takes you into places and makes a different human being out of you, makes a citizen out of you, and that kind of thing.
Right.
And of course, we have always taught history from the point of view of the hero. It's only now recently that it's begun to change, and people are talking about the past in different terms.
Right.
So that's always been there. And then there's always been this sense of the utopia. India was great in the time of Ashoka and Akbar and that kind of thing. Who knows what the reality was, because we can't go back into the past. But nevertheless, there is that faith. And so, even today, you feel that if there is a strong person who's handling governance, then you put your faith in that person.
Right. On that note, we'll end it there. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.